Chapter 10. There was an impatient knock on my door. Head still clouded with sleep, I roused slowly. When I didn't reach the door fast enough, there was another knock, louder and more urgent than the first. With an annoyed sigh, I threw the door open and found, much to my surprise, Grayson on the other side. The words, "What are you doing here?" made it only halfway out of my mouth before he crossed over the threshold, took hold of my head in both arms, and pulled me in close. I nearly stumbled, stunned, but he had a firm hold on me and assaulted my lips with his in a desperately hungry kiss. He took several steps forward, backing me further into the room towards the bed behind me. I woke with a start. I was sweating. I sat up, heart racing, glancing through the dark at the door, and then raising a hand to feel my lips. It had taken hours to fall asleep at all, my mind awhirl following the events of the afternoon. I kept thinking back to Grayson, pinning me to the floor in the storage room and rendering me helpless. And each time a blush rose to my cheeks. I couldn't shake the tingling feeling that twisted in my core whenever I thought of how close his hands had come to my chest, how his fingers had grazed my bare legs. And if I managed to tuck those thoughts away, the ones that came to replace them, or of how close I'd gotten to him after I'd finished treating his wound. Close enough to see the flecks of blue in his eyes. Close enough for his breath to warm my face. Exhaling, I shook my head. No. I should have been furious with him. It was completely inappropriate what he'd done, and I should have let the hole in his side fester. I stared up at the ceiling, frowning at the cracks in the wooden boards, as I tried to calm myself. It had been a strange moment of weakness, and nothing more. With my head swimming, I eventually drifted back into a fitful sleep. I awoke again to the steady rhythm of the ship rocking back and forth, and then spent far too long fussing with my hair at the tiny mirror before wondering why I was bothering. It had long since lost its curl and shine, and now for the most part hung limply around my shoulders, with only a vague saltwater wave. Still, I kept combing my fingers through it absent-mindedly, as I contemplated the prospect of seeing Grayson again, though I wanted nothing more than to forget last night's dream. My brain stubbornly rebelled against me, and wandered to it every time I let my guard down. I kept catching myself thinking of him, of his enthralling eyes, and the defined muscles in his chest and abdomen. Even worse was the fact that I genuinely couldn't tell whether or not he was just playing with me. My prior escapades had always been with soldiers or recruits under my father's command. Eager, starved young men that I'd had eating out of the palm of my hand within days. Grayson was an entirely different beast. In fact, it was wrong to describe him as a beast at all. A wave was a more apt comparison. Impossible to pin down. Dangerous one moment, and calm the next. No matter what I did or how I tried to approach, he had the advantage, able to crash down and overwhelm whenever he pleased. I'm doing it again, I realized, and scowled to myself. After much rumination, the practical side of me won over, and I decided to leave the cabin after all. I wanted to check on that Irish-looking, or was he German? The pirate whose leg I'd saved. Finn, as I remembered Grayson calling him. Pushing down another bout of hesitation, I exited the cabin and glanced towards the mess hall. I had been on this ship for a number of days that I had long since lost count of, And yet the thought of going in there, where the majority of the pirates slept and ate, still made my stomach churn. I had no reason to believe that any of them would be ill-behaved towards me. On the contrary, the few that I had briefly interacted with had been shy and overly courteous. Trying to convince myself that I had nothing to fear, I made my way to the large room that was just at the base of the staircase, and peered inside. There weren't many of them there. No surprise, considering most of them woke up as soon as the sun rose and got to work on deck. There were a few hushed voices from a back corner, however, and I spotted 3 still lingering. One I had seen frequently around the ship, and knew from listening to chatter that his name was Peter. A rather dull name for a pirate, I thought. The second I also vaguely recognized, though I knew him only in my head as the Spanish one, as his dark, olive-colored skin and Iberian accent stood out to me whenever I encountered him. The third was Finn, who was sitting upright against the wall on top of his bedroll, looking rather dazed. The other 2 noticed me in the entryway immediately and got to their feet. Finn didn't seem to see me at all. I cleared my throat awkwardly. "Sorry," I said, voice breaking. "I wanted to see if—" I trailed off, unsure how to finish my sentence, but I looked pointedly at Finn. The Spanish one turned his head towards me and blurted out,
"Is it wrong?"
I blinked in surprise. "He's—" Sure enough, I looked at Finn again and saw a glass bottle sitting beside him, with only a small amount of liquid left in the bottom. Peter shifted backwards on his heels.
"He kept complaining about the pain,"
he explained.
"So Grayson told him to drink until it was gone?"
The Spaniard finished. "Well, that's one way to handle it." I glanced again at Finn, who now appeared to be dozing off, though I pity his liver in the long run. May I?" It took them a moment to register that I was asking permission to approach, and after exchanging a glance, they nodded, stepping backwards to keep a respectful distance as I came closer. I bent down to examine my patient, at which point he finally took notice of me.
"Oh, who brought me such a pretty whore?"
he slurred.
"You shouldn't have."
Adios.
"Oh, Jesus Christ!"
Trying to ignore his drunken staring at my chest, I made my assessment. There were no signs of gangrene, but I wasn't surprised to hear that he'd been in pain. This was to be expected, after having a bullet removed without the proper surgical tools or anesthesia. Were he a patient on land, he might have been given a better painkiller than alcohol, but I doubted there was much in the way of medicine lying around on this ship. I leaned back with an exhale, and realized that both the Spanish pirate and Peter were watching me intently. They averted their eyes the moment I looked up, and so I pretended not to have noticed, getting to my feet. "It looks all right," I told them, "but the next time he's in pain, you could try turmeric rather than alcohol."
"Turmeric?"
the Spanish one repeated, puzzled. "It's a spice," I explained patiently. The 2 of them continued to look at me with blank faces, and I wondered if that was too exotic for them to have access to. Surely, they robbed spice merchants every now and again. "Or cloves," I offered, "if you have them." A voice cut into the conversation from behind.
"There might be some in the kitchen."
I turned. The moment I saw Grayson standing at the threshold, my mind flashed back to last night's dream, and my cheeks instantly began to blotch. Peter and the Spanish pirate jumped to explain themselves, talking over one another so that the words blended together.
"We didn't touch her, I
She came
swear."
in here on her own.
She came in here on her own, and we didn't touch her, I swear. were among the excuses made. Grayson waved a hand at them, rolling his eyes.
Don't you two have work to do?
Peter looked down at Finn.
He's fine,
Grayson interrupted.
And even if he wasn't, the two of you gawking at him is hardly going to do him any good.
Grayson stepped further into the mess hall, and then moved aside to clear the doorway, giving them a short jerk of his head.
Go on, get to it.
They didn't need to be told twice, each shooting me a nervous nod as they hurried out of the room. Silence. I swallowed hard, and Grayson's eyes flickered to Finn behind me, and narrowed in annoyance. I looked over my shoulder and caught him very much ogling me from behind. Grayson let out a breath, and then turned.
Come on, then,
he said. I blinked. What?
Turmeric, cloves.
Turmeric. He raised an eyebrow at me.
You think I know what these things look like?
Grayson whipped around and started back into the hallway, clearly meaning for me to follow. With a quick final glance at Finn, his moment of lucidity had faded and he was now drifting back to sleep. I quickened my feet to catch up. Having never been to the Libertas kitchen, I relied on Grayson to lead the way. Down through a hatch and a narrow staircase that descended further into the bowels of the ship. The cookpot, as well as the cautious fire they would light underneath of it, was up on deck, so it was more of a storeroom for foodstuffs than it was an actual kitchen. There were several heavy-looking crates pushed up against the walls, and various leaves and strips of meat and fish hanging from drying racks on the ceiling. A table stood in the center of the room, with a few utensils and carved wooden dishware scattered about, as well as a square wooden box, about 1 foot wide and 6 inches deep. Grayson grabbed the box and lifted the lid to confirm its contents before sliding it towards me.
Have a look. Don't know if it'll have what you need. I'm pretty sure that Jamie just throws whatever he wants into the food without really knowing what it is.
Having eaten that food for the past few weeks, I was inclined to agree with this assessment. The inside of the box was disorganized, filled not only with small jars and vials of various sizes, but also pouches and wrapped paper packages, with a smattering of seemingly random dried leaves collecting at the bottom. I chose one of the jars and opened it, then lifted it to my nose. Ginger. I set it aside and tried another. As I rooted around for anything that looked like turmeric or cloves, I could feel Grayson watching me closely. His presence, though unsettlingly silent, was heavy in the room, and I found with irritation that my hands were shaking slightly. I breathed in quietly to try and steady myself. After I discarded a 3rd container of cinnamon, he finally spoke up.
Why are you doing this?
It was a fair question. Some part of me had asked myself the same once or twice. But it was always a distant thought, never getting close enough to the front of my mind for me to seriously think about it. Still, I knew the answer. My mother always told me, I said, with a brief glance at him, that on the battlefield, a nurse tends to the injured no matter what colors he wears. It was something she'd said to me when I was very young, but it had stuck with me all these years, so deeply ingrained in my brain that it was impossible to shake. I began carefully unwrapping one of the paper parcels. Grayson watched me curiously.
You said your mother was a nurse,
he recalled.
but you didn't say that you were.
There was a question somewhere in that observation, but I chose to ignore it, inhaling with surprise as I opened the package and found several whole cloves inside. Grayson was quiet, perhaps waiting for me to respond, but my head went somewhere else as I took a quick stalk of the room and spotted a mortar and pestle collecting dust in one corner. I retrieved it and brought it back to the table, dumping the cloves inside before once again lifting my eyes to look around.
What do you need?
Grayson asked after a moment. This brought my attention back to him, and I blinked. Water, I said. Nodding, Grayson picked up a stray wooden bowl and took it over to a barrel on the left side of the room. He lifted the lid and dipped the bowl inside, then offered it back to me.
So?
He asked. I accepted the bowl of water and trickled a few drops into the mortar. So what?
Are you also a nurse?
He asked more directly, as I began to mash the cloves. I gripped the pestle harder and felt my knuckles begin to turn white as I channeled the flare of frustration I felt into the work. No, I admitted, keeping my voice even. There was a pause, and I crushed one of the cloves hard against the side of the mortar, watching it smear against the smooth stone. I wanted to be, I found myself saying, after a moment of consideration. I was going to be, but... I smiled humorlessly. My father didn't think it was an appropriate profession for a lady. Grayson's head tilted backwards slightly.
Then what is an appropriate profession for a lady?
I shot him a sideways glance, but of course the brief look was never enough to properly read his expression. I shook my head and looked back down at the bowl. Keeping the household, I said, child-rearing, pleasing her husband. It was difficult to refrain from rolling my eyes.
Ah, of course.
Grayson nodded in understanding, the corners of his mouth turning upwards in mischief.
And do you think your future husband will be pleased when he one day finds you grinding up food stores to smear on cuts and scrapes?
My hand stopped moving, and I looked fully at him for the first time in this exchange. His smile had widened, entertained by his own joke, and as much as I wanted to be annoyed by it, the grin was somehow contagious. Very funny, I muttered, trying to hide my own reluctant smile, as I ripped my gaze away with no small amount of effort. And here I thought I was the one with the sharp tongue. The cloves and water had now emulsified, forming an unappealing paste, and I laid the pestle down on the table. It was not as good as what Mother could have come up with, certainly, but it was better than nothing.
I don't know about sharp,
Grayson replied.
but I've been told it's quite talented.
I furrowed my brow, and without thinking, looked up at him. It was only when I saw him watching earnestly for my reaction that the innuendo sunk in. My stomach jerked, a blush rising unbidden to my cheeks. It was exactly what he had wanted, and I was immediately annoyed that I had given it to him. Unable to let that stand, I swallowed and tried to fight down the tension building in my chest. Not so talented when it comes to hiding your Cockney accent, innit? I shot back in a highly exaggerated version of the dialect. Some of the smugness faded from his face, and he clicked his tongue, averting his eyes. Not quite satisfied, I pushed further. Why do you try to hide it? I asked.
Maybe because I don't want nosy hostages asking me too many questions,
he replied, raising a playful eyebrow. The London cadence leaked through mid-sentence, and then vanished just as quickly as he caught himself and corrected it. I don't see the point, I told him. Surely you're not the only urchin who clawed his way out of the gutters of London and turned to piracy. Grayson's mouth hardened, and the eyebrow he had raised at me plummeted.
What makes you think that was the case?
All at once, the game we'd been playing evaporated into thin air. Startled by the sudden change in atmosphere, I stumbled over my words. I blinked twice, wondering if he was about to grin at me again and tell me he was only joking. But instead, he stared at me, expectant of an answer. I closed my mouth for a moment and then opened it again. I just assumed. I didn't mean...
I know what you meant.
He tore his eyes away from me, glaring at something indeterminate off to his left.
You shouldn't make assumptions about things you know nothing about.
Why did I feel as though I had just been slapped in the face? I wanted to say something, feeling words akin to an apology rising to the tip of my tongue. But my mouth couldn't seem to release them. At once he turned away.
If you don't need any more help, I have work to do,
he grumbled. He moved towards the exit. Finally, I got sound to come out and tried to stop him. Grayson! Too late. He let the door swing shut behind him, leaving me there with a phantom sting on my cheek.